Chinese Navy be like. The South Vietnamese Navy be like. It was a foggy morning in the summer of 1973. South Vietnam, also known as the Republic of Vietnam, was on its own after the Americans pledged to the international community that it would evacuate most of its troops from Indochina a year before. Leading up to the 1973 peace agreements, in 1972, South Vietnam won its first string of victories against the North Vietnamese army with the help of US air support. North Vietnam and the National Liberation Front forces have constantly been attacking positions all along the DMZ and the western corridor of South Vietnam. A lone South Vietnamese sailor sits in a guard tower looking over the South China Sea, wondering what is going to happen to his beloved country and its uncertain future. As he does, he spots an armada of ships ahead. He reaches out to command about the sightings of the ships and tries to identify them. They look like Soviet-styled ships. Could the North Vietnamese Navy be trying to open a front out in the sea? Suddenly, through his binoculars, it becomes clear. It is not the North Vietnamese Navy, but the Chinese Navy, and they're coming in fast. Thoughts race in his head. Are the Chinese actually invading Vietnam now like they did in Korea? Is World War III going to happen? Are the Americans coming back? Were North Vietnam and the People's Republic of China allying themselves again after what Nixon and Mao did? What in the world is going to happen? When the history of the Vietnam War is discussed, what is often brought up is the invasive American perspective, the World War II backstory, and the incessant use of tree people memes.
They're in the tree!
Because of these factors, a lot of the interesting and important things about the war and what shapes the events of the modern day are often ignored in favor of tree people wars.
Speak for the trees. Some fucking speak for the trees. And for some fucking reason, they're speaking. Go fuck yourself!
There's so much in the Vietnam War, from its battles to its politics, involvement of other nations, and events that are not just solely of the US or half-hearted North Vietnamese perspective, that it feels like it has as much information as a mini World War II history. Is essentially the World War II of gaming. Anyways, amongst other interesting topics of the war that we are never going to talk about, one of them involved two countries that never interacted, like ever. The People's Republic of China and the Republic of Vietnam. Most of the general pop history audience sees it as the US and their 51st State Republic of Vietnam versus the Viet Cong. But the thought of China fighting seems unthinkable, but it did happen. But it goes way back. We're talking about like the 800s BC, with ancient China and Imperial Vietnam having trips around the South Pacific. Throughout history, both of these two countries, Vietnam and China, discovered these islands called the Paracel Islands, a Portuguese designation. The dispute between these two countries over the Paracel Islands, or Jinsha Qin Dao in Chinese, or the
Quần đảo Hoàng Sa
in Vietnamese, goes back to imperialistic dynastic roots, where fishermen ventured around these islands to gather resources. By the 1884 Sino-French War, the Nguyen administration over the islands was handed over to the French, effectively making it a Chinese versus French Cold War,
Those Chinese sons of a bitches are going down.
with the French on the southwest side of the islands and the Chinese in the northeast. When Japan began its military conquest into the Chinese mainland in the early 1930s, it began complaining about the ownership of the islands as it is near their colony of Taiwan. In response, the French seized the rest of the islands under Indochina territory, knowing that both China and Japan were caught up in their own war. In 1946, a year after Japan lost World War II, control of the islands was seized by the Republic of China on Woody Island. The French, also still existing, tried to dislodge the Chinese, but couldn't, so they just settled for Paddle Island in the southwest instead. When the nationalist Chinese lost the Chinese Civil War, the rest of the Chinese soldiers and sailors regrouped to Taiwan, leaving the islands to the Communist Chinese, who took it over in 1950, a year after the mainland fell. By 1954, France has left the area altogether, being that they lost the French Indochina War, and accepting the independence of the two Vietnams. Now, it is back to square one. 2 years later, the PLA, also known as the People's Republic of China, re-established themselves on Yongtsing Island, while the South Vietnamese took 3 islands, including the abandoned French camp on Shan Hu Island, and built a weather station there. In 1958, North Vietnam sent a letter recognizing China's claim over the Paracel Islands. Wow, really? With the war waging in Indochina and China's jealousy over North Vietnam getting a little too comfortable with the USSR, things only got hotter in the South China Sea by 1967. With Mao Zedong becoming a literal corpse and North and South Vietnam being distracted by the war, Deng Xiaoping in command, Chinese leadership's about to conduct one of the most devious licks of the 20th century, the Battle of the Paracel Islands, 1974. Vietnam War stuff happens, US bad, evil, go home and stuff. South and North Vietnam are still fighting, oh my god, it's 1973. America is leaving Indochina. For the Chinese, they have 2 prospects. North Vietnam, which is very close by, still depended on Chinese resources to invade the South, while the Soviet Union, bullying the Chinese on the border of Mongolia, is too far to make any advances on these possibly oil-rich islands, with the American juggernaut being distracted by conflicts in Southeast Asia. The ambitious Chinese leadership decided to encourage more fishermen to head to the islands as early as 1959, having scuffles with the South Vietnamese fishermen on these crescent islands, and are constantly being pushed off by the Vietnamese Navy there. To get a simple understanding of the geographic situation, South Vietnam de facto owned the Crescent Group of the islands, southwest, while the Chinese owned the Amphimedy Group, the northeast of the islands. The scuffles between the South Vietnamese and Chinese fishermen went back and forth for months until January 10, 1974, when the South Vietnamese Navy captured Chinese fishermen and televised them on South Vietnam TV, forcibly admitting their wrongdoing. This made Beijing understandably mad and announced that South Vietnam is taking their territory on January 11, 1974. Realizing the implications, the South Vietnamese Navy dispatched 4 ships to the western part of these islands. By January 16, 1974, 6 Vietnamese army officers and 1 American observer go on the sea frigate Lý Thung Kiet, also known as HQ-16, on an inspection tour. They see 2 not suspiciously armored Chinese fishing boats off Drummond Island helping some Chinese PLA troops. What they saw were several bunkers and 2 Kronstadt-class submarines. They reported this to Saigon, allowing more South Vietnamese sailors to head over and have a little discussion with the Chinese. When the Vietnamese Navy sized up with the Chinese, it became a blame game. The Vietnamese ships were in bad shape, but so were the Chinese ships. The Cultural Revolution, which happened a decade before, had but ruined China's shipyards all throughout the country, through how many skilled workers were killed or imprisoned. A day later, on January 17, 1974, 30 to 40 South Vietnamese Navy SEALs infiltrated Robert Island and took down the People's Republic of China flag and put up the Republic of Vietnam one. Frigate Chun Canh Tzu, also known as HQ-4, joined HQ-16 in going up against 2 PLA Navy minesweepers who arrived shortly after. On January 18th, the commander of the South Vietnamese fleet, Colonel Ha Van Nyak, joined the battle with another frigate and an additional corvette. At dawn, the Chinese landed 1 maritime militia platoon on each of the Palm and Drummond Islands. All the platoons on these islands dug in and built defenses. South Vietnam had 4 warships, a platoon of Navy SEALs, an underwater demolition team, and a regular ARVN platoon garrisoned at one of these islands. The Chinese also had 4 ships, including 2 submarines, 2 Marine battalions, an unknown number of irregular militia, and 2 Shenyang J-6 fighter planes. Why didn't they make a Battlefield Vietnam map out of this?
One of my favorite things about being Vietnamese or Asian in general is just how clever we are when it comes to naming our restaurants. For example,
Mẹ mày, thằng lồn nào á? Mẹ mày alo! Alo!
On the 24th anniversary of China's recognition of North Vietnam, January 19, 1974, the Chinese Navy split their ships into 2 groups, 4 in the forward group and some in the rear. South Vietnam had two groups as well, sending one group, the HQ 4 and 5, towards Money, Antelope, and Duncan Island. HQ 10 and HQ 16 cut through the Crescent Group Lagoon. Two of the Chinese subchasers of the forward group watch HQ 4 and 5, while the other two minesweepers watch HQ 10 and 16. HQ 16's captain sped past the Chinese minesweepers and launched 14 Navy SEALs on Duncan and Palm Island. By 10:24 a.m., the Vietnamese Navy ships opened fire on the smaller Chinese ships, but were outmaneuvered by them. HQ 16 rams into the Chinese minesweeper 389, resulting in sailors on both sides firing small arms fire towards each other. With no Navy support, the South Vietnamese Navy SEALs are pushed back by the dug-in militia on the Duncan and Palm Islands. 3 Vietnamese died, while several were wounded as they retreated to their rubber boats. HQ 16 is heavily damaged by 37mm fire from the Chinese minesweepers, destroying their means of radar and communications. Chinese minesweepers get within 10 yards of HQ 10, but the Vietnamese cannot fire their guns over the low-lying Chinese ships. Chinese crews kill HQ 10's captain and most of the navigation team with small arms fire. HQ 16 tries to come and save the day, but is repelled by Chinese fire. HQ 16, 4, and 5 withdrew south. By 1 p.m., the Chinese rear group, consisting of Hainan-class subchasers, arrived and sank HQ 10, also known as the Nhat Dao. All 4 Vietnamese ships were damaged. As it sunk, the lieutenant commander of the ship, Nguyen Van Ta, went down with the ship. The sea battle lasted 40 minutes.
Been falling for 30 minutes!
But the impact lasted decades. Soon the PLA Air Force based in Hainan began launching sorties over Money, Paddle, and Robert Island, containing the stranded ARVN and Vietnamese Navy SEALs. Fearing the South Vietnamese will get reinforcements, the Chinese dogpiled 500-something militia, marines, and soldiers into these islands with sampans and rubber boats. Robert Island was taken in 10 minutes. At Paddle Island, the 30 SEALs fended off the incoming invaders for an hour and surrendered after being pushed to the center of the islands. Within these islands, a U.S. advisor from the embassy of Saigon was captured along with the Vietnamese Navy SEALs. Imagine you're a Vietnam War vet and you get captured by Chinese Marines. No motherfucker will believe you. Like, how much did you have to fuck up to be in that situation? The Vietnamese Navy SEALs abandoned Money Island and avoided capture, but only for several days. On January 20th, 1974, the Paracel Islands was effectively, de facto, occupied by the People's Republic of China.
You know this song is a Korean! You stupid Vietnamese try to copy the Korean.
The Chinese won, and the South Vietnamese negotiated a prisoner release within a week through Hong Kong. Over 100 South Vietnamese were killed, along with 48 Vietnamese service members and 1 American officer captured. The Chinese admitted to 18 dead and 67 wounded on their side. Both sides had heavily damaged ships, but only 1 sunk on the South Vietnamese side. At the same time all this was happening, South Vietnamese intel was tracking that North Vietnamese troops were making moves all along Laos and Cambodia. When Saigon fell in 1975, the United Vietnam military seized the Spratly Islands held by South Vietnam originally, angering China. Despite all this, North Vietnam makes no congratulatory comment on China's victory over these islands. So, you gonna congratulate me on my victory, North Vietnam?
What do you mean we?
I mean, you did win it. Yeah, and? So yeah, I want to thank my South Vietnamese puppet government fighters for defending Vietnam against these. As they had a back and forth, the USSR fortified their positions over the border of Mongolia, as well as sent more troops around Southeast Asia. Despite originally stating that the Paracel and Spratly Islands were China's, Vietnam states that the Paracel and Spratly Islands belong to them. China is understandably not happy. By the 1980s, a united Vietnam and the Chinese Navy had skirmishes all around the Spratly Islands, but this time China won again. Despite these hostilities, they still do trade and stuff, so it's just a matter of political military remindings of, that they don't like each other. It may seem like it's a small event, but it still had big repercussions. Not only is Mao's perception of the Vietnamese as a whole, but also China's omni-battle with 7 other Asian nations over a totally non-exploitive use of one of the world's most important sea lanes in the 2010s. The PRC still owns the Paracel Islands today, yet their own allies complain about them having it. North Vietnam even commended the South Vietnamese that defended these islands, and that's probably the only time the North and South agree on something for once.
Oh man, it's such a beautiful day out here in the jungle. Nothing can go wrong on such a beautiful day.